Alrighty, so this is a presentation on the final refinement and laying out of your environmental design using various tools. So this is for your final folio. So you've produced your overall designs and your renders, and you've got all of your drawings, your technical drawings, and you're looking to compile it all into one large kind of hero layout which tells the entire story. As you're probably aware, with your final folio you will have full-size printouts of, say, your floor plans and, say, a planimetric drawing, but you're also going to want to have at least one big A2 or A1 poster which tells the whole story and really paints a picture as your final piece de la resistance. So in this particular instance, the example I'm using is a competition I recently entered for micro homes, so basically around sustainable living and ensuring that you can create livable and comfortable accommodating spaces within a small space. So as you can see in the screen in front of me, my general idea here is that we've got this this home, and you've got these two kind of revolving turntables. And depending on whether you're sleeping, working, gathering or socializing or relaxing, the turntables kind of turn and create this sort of central space. So it's a pretty simple idea. We've got little man here, which suggests that it's all sort of mobile phone operated, that you kind of swipe into sleep mode and you've got your little master bedroom set up and yada yada yada. There's a few little things I've done is I've created a little symbol library, and you're going to see those little symbols appearing as wayfinding methodologies within the presentation. So just as little Easter eggs. A lot of this presentation is about how you can visually communicate your core ideas without necessarily being too wordy. Really, ideally, you would be able to communicate most of your messages using excellent visual communications, hence the name of the subject, and then anything that requires that can't fully be communicated or needs supporting, that's where your text kind of falls into. So I'm going to show you first the main thing that we need to achieve is to create our asset library. So I'm going to walk you through the asset library, and basically that's just all of the images that you've created, all of the technical drawings, all of the renders that you've done, all compiled together in a folder. That's before you do anything. You're going to want to do that. So this is the first one. This is kind of the little narrative. So this sort of tells what we're trying to achieve and what the general concept is. Moving on from that, we've of course got our technical drawings of a floor plan. So very important that you adhere to VCAA guidelines in terms of dimensioning, expectations, use of symbols, use of lines. You can artistically interpret it by adding your own textures and shadows, but definitely make sure that none of the conventions are done incorrectly more than anything. That you've got your scale, you've got your everything's been interpreted correctly. So I've got this drawing. It tells a few little things. Mainly it's just around the conventions. Now, one of the important things that I did here was to ensure that the conventions that I talk about are specifically important to the brief. So I'm making sure that I've listed the dimensions, because this particular space, it was important that this was within 25 square meters. That was part of the brief. So only ensuring that you add in the details that are relevant to the brief. Now, moving on from this, I've created a handful of renders as well. So you're going to be doing the same. Some students have chosen to do these renders using manual drawing methods, and that's perfectly fine as long as you've got a really nice, well-presented manual drawing. In my particular instance, I've chosen to do mine in Blender, so we can skip over here. The main reason for this is, as you can see, I've been able to render it out, and if I go into my camera view, we can see that I can render out particular sections, so everything in here, and I can just go camera to view and perhaps render out this section and do little zoom ins. So once you've created this 3D model, you are kind of free to move about the model as you please and create many renders, which always looks just that little bit more impressive than just say one render. So using Blender for that, so that's effectively that. The next thing I've done is you're creating an environmental design, not a communication design. The logo might have been in your second communication need, but even if it hasn't been, and your second communication need was say a package design or something else, you still want to do like a mini logo, so a really simplified logo. I'm calling this particular idea or concept Revolve because it of course revolves. How clever. So yeah, make sure that you produce some sort of nice typographic logo to tie in, even if logo wasn't necessarily part of your communication need. I've also done an exploded view. Really good idea to do something like this. Now you will note that this is not done in Planimetric. The VCAA require your environmental drawings to be done in Planimetric, and it might be seen as an error if you don't. So just be aware that this particular set of conventions that I've produced in this is not done to the expectations of VCAA. You will need to do that, so you will need to produce a Planimetric drawing. Go into a bit of detail. This is of course my Planimetric drawing. It was produced in Illustrator. This isn't a technical presentation, so I'm not going to necessarily go into great detail, but just to say that I've produced these previously in Illustrator. If we scan over here, this is what they look like in Planimetric view. So you might be able to tell just by looking at this why I chose to squash it into closer to an isometric view, simply because this takes up way too much vertical space. So that was a decision that I made. This competition I'm entering does not need to adhere to the VCAA standards, so we'll skip over that. I've also done a series of supporting graphics. Now, as I was saying with Blender, you can produce these quite easily just by moving the camera about. I created a mini animation, so they're kind of revolving. So we've got this sort of entertaining space, we've got ourselves our home office space, we've got ourselves our movie night space, and then we've got ourselves our bedroom space, which is effectively the four that we're using. Now, before you get into your layout, of course, you've started compiling these. Also have a think about perhaps incorporating some textures for the background or some patterns for the background. You really want to create a nice cohesive aesthetic. You don't necessarily want everything to fall directly onto a white background. So have a bit of a think about collecting a few textures. Also have a bit of a think about creating some stock photos of your own, so you can cut yourself out. So take some photos of yourself and cut yourself out. Top Designs also does allow for stock images to be used if they don't form the basis of your design. So as long as they're there for background decorative uses, and as long as they are appropriately acknowledged as being not your own, you can still enter Top Designs by using stock images. However, I do recommend, for the purpose of the experience, taking your own. I did not for this instance. I've used stock images. A couple of other small things is that we've just got, finally, I suppose we've got this exterior view as well. So I've done a few things with that too, just for the purpose of the exercise. Now let's jump in. I've talked enough. I've effectively gone into my Finder here, and to get started, I've just dragged and dropped everything in. So we can go into InDesign, which I'm doing my layout in, and we can see that I've just dragged and dropped everything in. I've put some text in too, so there is quite a bit of text involved, but first and foremost, your most important thing is just to get everything laid out onto your A2 or your A1 or your A3, and just get it all visually sitting there. Now the next really important step is, now I'm going to be going through effectively the design principles for this. They are so important to make such a big difference. The biggest decision that you're going to need to make is what is going to be the most important. So we're looking at hierarchy now. What are the most important elements in your design, and what are less important supporting elements? In a perfect world, of course, you want all of the elements to be super big and stand out, but you need to think about hierarchy. What do you want to be the main hero, and what do you want to kind of just be supporting secondary images? So my particular layout, I've chosen that my big hero is going to be this big, beautiful graphic which kind of tells the whole story. Secondarily, I've got my branding. So this is the intro. Now, the purpose of this is to identify. So I've got my little logo and a brief introduction into what it was I was trying to achieve. In a tertiary, so third down the hierarchy, we've got guide and inform. Now, these are those graphics and diagrams that I did, which just help to tell the story. They basically form that sort of functional understanding of what it is we're trying to achieve. As a fourth thing, I've got all my supporting images. So these are all secondary images. So they help to support the story, but they're not necessarily the whole story. And we kind of want them to fall back a little bit. Otherwise, everything's just going to try to stand out. And if everything stands out, then nothing stands out. An important rule to remember. And then finally, we've got our supporting text. As I said, you really want the visuals to tell as much of the story as possible. And then your supporting text is basically just there to help communicate anything that might not necessarily be obvious. So let's skip over. I've scaled this now. So we've determined our priorities and I've scaled these accordingly. So as you can see, I've used scale as the main premise to determine hierarchy. I've made my hero image really big and I've shrunk down these images quite a lot. I've increased the size of my diagrams because they're priority 3. The only thing I haven't scaled is this revolve over here and this introduction text. The main reason for that is you would be very surprised how small text should be in an A2 or an A1 document. This is size 12 typeface, so it's quite small. You don't want to be using a size 20 typeface for your body copy. It's clunky, it doesn't make it any easier to read, and if someone's reading this body copy text, they're not going to be standing 2 meters away. They're only going to be reading this when they're fully engaged. So you've caught their eye from a couple of meters away with this hero. Now they're standing up close and they're reading the text. So it can be quite small. And if it's large, it can look quite clunky. So just be aware of that. So let's skip over now to balance. So we're looking now, so we've determined the hierarchy effectively through the scale. But we're now using balance to effectively compose and distribute the visual weight of the different items. So as a vague guide, I've got my identify elements up the top. Now they're quite small. As I said, I didn't use scale to increase the introduction text size or the logo that used to identify the brand. So the way that I'm going to push them further up the hierarchy is by putting them up in the top left, so being the first thing that the user sees, because we always, of course, are attracted to the top left of the page in Western culture, where we read left to right, top to bottom. I've got my promote. Now these are going to be mostly my graphic images. So the graphic images really help to promote because they're attractive, they're aesthetically pleasing, and they have that wow factor. Now I'm going to keep on the right hand side, the visual weight here is going to be distributed into the diagrams. So we're going to put guide and inform, and all of the diagrams are going to have their own little space, so you can see how this flow is going to happen. You identify, you get attracted by the designs, and then you can move into the more granular details. So if we overlay that now this isn't an exact science. You can see that I haven't quite perfectly fallen into the grid, but the general gist is the majority of my promote, aesthetically pleasing, attractive, audience attention gaining images are here. We've coordinated all of our diagrams and all of our granular information to the right hand side, and over here we've got our revolve nice up the top left hand corner to make sure that it's the first thing you see. So if we remove that, we can start seeing how this layout's balanced compositionally in order to aid in the narration of the text. So that's balance. Now the next thing, now we're starting to move into creating a nice cohesive aesthetic. So the main thing that I'm going to do is, you'll probably notice that a lot of my concept here is around this kind of circular design. So I want to create some circular graphics to support that. So everything's going to kind of point towards this underpinning concept of circles. Now, in order to do that, I'm calling on cropping. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be cropping out these images into that circular shape. So that means the images themselves and the way they're laid out further supports and contextualizes my aesthetic. So here we go. We've cropped them out. I've created a nice little swoosh here, and I've put these into circles. They've kind of got their own little bubbles. Didn't necessarily aid in the aesthetic. You could argue that they looked a little bit nicer with the rectangle, but it certainly did aid in pushing the point and really reinforcing that core concept. So that's cropping. Now, another thing that we're going to notice is we're going to move into figure ground. So at the moment, everything is figure. Everything's just what sits in the foreground. There's nothing really behind here for the figure to sit on to kind of create that context. So, and also sort of help with the contrast as well. I think we need some nice background images to really push forward those figures and help with the context of where this sits. So I'm going to start with this one over here. So to aid in this, I've created a figure in the foreground. So I've slotted in one of my stock images. I've put some grass in. I've put some real deep ground in the city here. This was the competition or brief said that it's for a professional couple. So you want to make sure that you bring that into your concept by drawing in some of the city skyline. In my instance, I've put a bit of a sky. So a little bit of figure here, and I've also kind of added a bit more figure here in that we can kind of see through these windows and into the building, which just aids it with a bit of context there. Moving on from that, I want to create a figure for this background image. At the moment, it just sits on white, and it kind of just looks a bit just sort of clunked and plunked in there. So we want some ground for it to sit on to really contextualize it. So click, and here we go. We've got this really nice ground to kind of act as a background and kind of bring it all in and reinforce this circular pattern. Some of the ground, of course, you might not be able to see it, but I've added just a bit of city in as well. So we can start to see that this is really starting to bring it all together through the use of figure ground by incorporating some ground to reinforce and to support and bolster that figure. Now I've taken this to the next level now by adding some more figures in. So we've got our little stock characters there. That really helps create this kind of scale reference. It creates a personal human touch. I've added, there's the little guy in the background there as well. I've added a few little elements here. And another thing I've put in the figure is this little symbol. This is called a bit of an Easter egg. It's just a clever incorporation of these symbols that I produced for this diagram, just to reinforce the message. And you'll be able to see, if you've got a bit of a keen eye, you can see that I've incorporated these in various other spots, and they just sort of give hints as to what the time of day might be. So have a bit of a think about that. They're clever little wayfinding methods which just help to tell that story. Now we're really moving into the nitty-gritty part of the design. So I'm going to call on a bit of contrast. Something I've noticed, and this is that real 1% kind of final finishing touches. You recall that I looked at that texture. At the moment, we've got this really kind of deep, colorful image here, but it's all kind of sitting on white, and I think that it's missing out a little bit of texture. So the design element of texture, or you could even perhaps think about some sort of background pattern. You don't want this to be overpowering, but let's have a look. So we can see here, now I'm just going to change my view, my display performance to high quality. You can kind of see just in this corner here that I've just gently fed in a little bit of that concrete texture. So that helps give a bit of definition to the grid that I've stuck to. And we're going to move on now to the finished bit, where I've also added some textures kind of in this background here. So now you can really see that concrete texture. It's very, very subtle, but it is designed to just help bring everything together and create a nice cohesive layout. A lot of those subtleties, those 1%ers, can make such a big difference to your aesthetic. So there you go. That's guiding you through the laying out of your composition. So the main things that I want you to get from this are that it's one thing to create really beautiful images, but it's a whole nother thing to be able to lay them out in a really nice cohesive manner, which tells a really neat story and guides the viewer through all of the different aspects of what you are trying to achieve. The second thing there that I want you to take from this is to really draw on those design principles in your layout. Really think about hierarchy, think about the scale and how big the different things need to be based on how important they are to the user. Balance as well in the same vein, balancing out your artboard or your artwork so that the user is provided with a cohesive narrative, so they're guided gently through the different aspects of your design. Always think about cropping, how you're going to crop those images out and focus in on just the most important elements. Think about figure ground. How does these foreground graphics relate or interrelate with the background, and how can you use the background to support and bolster what you're trying to say? Thinking about contrast, so making sure that you've got equal amounts of light and dark. So thinking about whether you want to have bold, striking, outstanding contrast so that one thing really explodes out of the page, or whether you wanted to have a much more harmonious overall aesthetic that's easy on the eyes and a bit lower in contrast. So thinking about that. I didn't do much on the other elements of proportion and pattern for this, but you can also think about things like proportion, and that could be how images are stretched or skewed to fit the purpose or to create an interesting aesthetic. And also pattern. For the background, I've chosen to use texture, but you might choose to create, I could have just as easily created some sort of circular pattern to help reinforce that idea of circular. So I hope you got a lot from that, and yeah, I look forward to seeing some really amazing layouts.